Well, let me introduce myself. My name's Keagan. I've been kind of around the Denver Bit Devs space for a while. I left for a bit. I came back. I've met some of you. I haven't met some others. So definitely come say hi afterwards if we haven't chatted before, or even if we have. A little bit about me and the relevance as it pertains to this is I worked on the Lightning Network, particularly on LND, doing various protocol development and software development for about a year and a half. I recently changed over to Alpine, which is the shirt I'm wearing now. We don't do Lightning stuff, but yeah, I've spent a lot of time in deep in the weeds of the Lightning Network. So I'm here to sort of explain pretty much anything anyone wants to know. But before I get started, I do want to ask a question really around if three of you could let me know what you really want to come away from this presentation with the knowledge of, or like having some question answered, I can sort of use that to guide both like the level and the direction of the presentation overall. So the question is, should you get a Lightning node and set it up and finance it and let it run? We will answer that. The answer to that is yes, you should. It's fucking cool. The actual more detailed answer might depend on your various motivations, and we'll go into some of that as well. I'd imagine that there are motivations regarding whether or not you want to send payments, whether you want to receive payments, whether or not you want to make money doing routing. All of those things we can definitely cover. Those are more operational, what it's like to actually run these things. Most of my presentation is going to focus primarily on how it works, though. So that's my area of expertise. I have some insight into the other questions, but ultimately I can just tell you a bunch of facts, and you kind of have to decide whether or not you quote unquote should run it or not. I'll tell you what it can do. Okay. Yeah, no, that's fine. So liquidity management, connection choice, right? Who you want your channel peers to be, and then splicing, I guess, really as it pertains to liquidity management, or do you mean more just how does the actual splice work? Okay. Okay. There is a fifth, and Lightning, I think. It's very new. The C# one? Yeah. Yes. On here, yeah, there's you can basically DM me your questions using this, poll.denver.space, if you're not on the network. Because that's how that works for some reason. Yeah, so that we can do more. I'll take more specific questions with that. I was just trying to get a little bit of a high level of what do you guys want to talk about? Yeah, you. You should just talk to my brother. So another piece of information, I'll just throw this out there right now. I was one of the co-founders of Start9. For those of you who are familiar unfamiliar, it is a company that tries to make node management software of Bitcoin, but also of just general personal sovereignty things much more accessible. My brother still runs the tech side of that. Matt Hill, who comes around maybe from time to time, although he's very busy, so he doesn't come around that often, is the CEO. They're just down the street, if I can dox them a little bit like that. And then I think you had one as well. The latest. So I'll do my best. I can actually check kind of live during the presentation about and scan what is the latest. But to be honest, I'm about 4 to 5 months out of date on the latest. So depending on. Okay. All right. Sam. Yes. All right. We'll definitely cover that. I promise. It's probably where we'll start. Yeah, great questions. And yeah, I can try to cover some of that. So, like, anything else? You can't. I mean, you can, but you have to be. I mean, like, we'll talk about what it takes to make money, and then you can decide whether or not you can or not. Because it is possible. It's just it's way harder than anybody like wants to think. All right, so I think maybe the place to start then is like, what the hell is the Lightning Network to begin with? Which does anybody like? Do people feel like they know what it is? Like just at a very high level, like what problems it's solving, and like kind of roughly how is it solving it? Okay, all right. So the bottom line is that the way that Bitcoin transactions work is that it's like a very, very limited throughput. Like if you go to I'm sure many of you have been to mempool.space, and plenty of times in the last couple of years, like you've seen like just the mempool absolutely firewalled, like paying gajillion sats per byte on your transactions, costing maybe $30, pay a fee for something that you might only want to pay like $20 for. So completely unfeasible fee requirements in certain instances to be able to actually deliver the payments that you want to do. So that makes Bitcoin cease to function as a medium of exchange when that happens. So there's this question of like, okay, well, how can we scale the number of transactions that we can do with Bitcoin without having to introduce new trust, or without having to trust anyone? And I put that in quotes because people tend to have this belief that either you're trusting someone or you're not trusting someone. And the reality is that there's like a whole spectrum. And Lightning does indeed introduce new trust assumptions, but they're much softer than saying like, hey, deposit your money at a bank and we'll just like do the transactions for you. So, I think Zach said, does everyone here feel like they're comfortable with the actual like mechanics of Bitcoin transactions? Forget Lightning for a second, but like TX-ins, TX-outs, all that jazz. Do we need to cover that? Raise your hand if we need to cover that. Okay. I'm going to cover it very briefly since only one of you raised your hand. But so the bottom line is that transactions in Bitcoin kind of work in this way where you basically have you kind of bundle up a set of receipts that you got in terms of like you were paid in the past. Like so if you got like different stubs for payments, like you can point to those and be like, hey, because I have these, like I have the right to pay these other things. And the only real requirement is that the outputs add up to fewer than the inputs, to less than the inputs, where the difference is like the fee, right? The important part about this is that any construction that we have to like solve scaling ultimately has to boil down to this at the end of the day. I don't care if it's Lightning. I don't care if it's stuff we're doing over at Alpen with the BitVM bridge stuff, which we'll talk about like next month. But the bottom line is like anything that we do on top of Bitcoin is going to end up looking like this at some point. And if it can't, then we cannot guarantee the security of the system. So there's a question of like, what the hell is a Lightning channel? And actually, maybe I should talk about the sort of Lightning model first before I talk about that. But this is going to be really important. And so if we need to ask questions during the presentation about this stuff, that's fine. Please do, because it will gate some of the other topics that we'll cover. So the key observation of Lightning is that we might want, like, there might be recurring payment flows back and forth between two parties. And if you've ever gone out with your drinking buddies or something like that, and you've decided like, hey, like you don't sort of pay each other like on Venmo, or if you're actually doing Bitcoin stuff. Like I don't use Bitcoin as an example here because we're trying to solve that right now. You don't pay them back and forth for every single like beer that you order for the table, or vice versa. You kind of just the vibe is like if you're settling up at all, you're kind of settling up at the end of the night. And so the observation is that many like transactions that happen like over time can be accumulated into a single one later, and vice versa. Like so if you have payments that go backwards along that, then like this arrow might get shorter. But the point is that you can net out this net flow between two parties. Does that make sense so far? No questions. All right. That's cool and all, but if you want to be able to efficiently pay people, setting up one of these channels, right? Like I'll hand wave this for now, but like if I just told you that setting up one of these channels required a Bitcoin transaction, and your immediate thought is, okay, well, let me set up payment channels with every merchant that I ever want to pay. It's like, okay, that kind of sucks because like you probably pay like hundreds or like thousands of different merchants maybe in a year. And like you don't want to have to make hundreds or thousands of Bitcoin transactions just to cover that. So what if I told you that you could, chain these things together and that Alice can pay Carol through Bob? Do larger things. That'd be pretty cool because now, in order for, it's not obvious at like 3, but it becomes like much more obvious like with 4. So let's say Dave is here. Is that now we only have 3 channels required in order for all 4 nodes to be connected. As opposed to if they all had to be able to pay each other, we'd have these like 3 additional channels, right? That would need to be done. So like we kind of can scale, like, and this actually gets better the larger the network gets. So like the number of possible edges that you could have in the graph of the network, where a graph is like just these like diagrams with like dots and arrows. The number of required edges that form what is called like the minimum spanning tree of a graph is significantly smaller than the maximum number of edges as the graph gets bigger. So this is really good because it means like, okay, well now we can access, we have the ability to pay people in like with increasing leverage. The bigger the network gets, and so we need a lot fewer of these to make that work. Now this is for channel establishment. So I think one of you asked, like, what does it even mean to make an off-chain payment? Or actually, let me pause right there. Are there any questions so far? In fact, actually, I'm going to demand one person ask a question to break the ice. I will not proceed until someone asks a question. Great. So, what is a Lightning channel? It's a transaction, right? So, it costs the fees of roughly 1 transaction. Now, what kind of transaction is it? We can talk about that a little bit because so at the end of the day, how is it that we can guarantee that you will always be able to recover your funds from a channel in like any scenario? So if we imagine the channel really is like this sort of machine, I'm just not gonna put the cap back on this. If we imagine that the channel is some sort of machine that just like has, let's do this differently. You've probably seen diagrams that look like this before if you've ever been on like a Lightning wallet where you kind of like have this bar and there's like a certain amount of money that's like on one side versus the other. This is like the way we like to think about it, but at the end of the day, what this is a Bitcoin transaction, exactly like that pays out to Alice and to Bob. And the thing that it spends is what is called the channel point. So we basically dump the money into this like UTXO that has this like, we've kind of written a contract against it in the form of making these transactions. So in order to close the channel, we take, Alice and Bob both store copies of this transaction and they will periodically sign new versions of it. We'll talk about that in a second. But what ends up happening is that in order to close the channel, they just submit this transaction to chain. So when we say that Alice is going to pay Bob, that, in order for Alice to pay Bob, what we're going to do is like kind of shrink Alice's bar, right? and then, more of it ends up on Bob's side. What actually ends up happening is that Alice, if, she's owed, 6 coins and Bob is owed 4, and then she wants to pay 1, they're just going to basically invalidate this transaction, and we'll talk about how that happens in a second. And then basically you sign a new one. Actually, it's in the other order. You sign the new one, and then you invalidate the old one. That's important because otherwise you can get into trouble with the new updated balances. And then so the net result is that it looks like Alice paid Bob, but they really just signed a new transaction that had the balances updated. Yes. Yes-ish, except for the person who asked about splicing. So splicing has the ability to change that, but again, everything's a Bitcoin transaction, right? So in order to make the channel bigger, you have to spend the channel point, add some inputs, right? So this is like the existing money. So let's say that there was 10 in there, right? If we want to add capacity, then we might say hey, I want to add 2 more Bitcoin worth of capacity. I have to spend this and another input that adds 2 Bitcoin into a new channel point, right, that has the 12 in it. And then you redo the scheme off of that new channel point. So that's how splicing works at a very high level. Okay. Any other questions? I'm trying to figure out where to go next precisely. All payment channels are bidirectional, so there's only 2 people on each channel, but there is no limit to the number of distinct channels that Bob can have or that Alice can have. And even with each other. So Alice can just launch another channel with Bob, and then this one might have, this much money in it. And then can use them both. And in fact, a lot of if you've ever seen references to something called multi-part payments or atomic multipath payments, they exploit this by sort of at a high level making the pair of channels here look like a single one from the user's perspective. Yeah, let's talk about privacy. So that's a really great question, and I want to actually frame the entire privacy discussion with the knowledge, with kind of a way to think about it. So we have Alice, we have Bob, we have Carol, and we have Eve, right? So let's say that there are channels here, and there's a question of, let's suppose that the scenario here is that Alice wants to pay Carol. There's a lot of different privacy questions to ask. There's a question of what does Alice know about Carol? What does Carol know about Alice? What does Bob know about either Carol or Alice? And what does Eve know about all 3 of them, right? Those are a bunch of distinct privacy questions to ask, right? You can imagine scenarios where you might be okay with, hey, Alice is paying Carol, and Alice is okay with knowing who Alice is. That's a normal privacy violation that it'd be cool to be able to obscure, but a lot of people would be totally fine with. And there's also the intermediaries, what they're allowed to know, and then sort of third parties altogether. And I think people have different feelings about the privacy compromises that they make about each of these different things. So remember that there's no oh, this is completely private. Well, I mean, I guess you could think of completely private as no one knows anything about anyone. That's impossible. And so it's always, when we talk about privacy and as you think about it in general, it's who knows what about whom? That's the sort of anchor that I want you to come back to. So in this case, in the scenario that I outlined that Alice wants to pay Carol, Bob does not know that the sender is Alice. Bob also does not know that Carol is the recipient. Carol does not know who Alice is at all. However, Alice does know who Carol is. And then Eve knows nothing. Is that true? Eve knows that maybe a payment occurred. Bob definitely knows that a payment occurred because he was part of it. Does that kind of get a little bit to what you're after? And this, just to make this point a little bit more like robust, right? If you have Carol, and then all the way to Dave, Bob and Carol's like visibility is functionally identical, right? They both know. So Bob knows that Alice was the immediate upstream of the payment, and Carol was the immediate downstream, and Carol knows that Bob was the immediate upstream, and Dave was the immediate downstream. But neither of these nodes know whether or not they were just the upstream was just another intermediary, or the downstream is just another intermediary, or whether it's one of the terminal endpoints of the payment. Okay. How is we can dive into maybe. Well, I'm trying to figure out like roughly how much time to spend on the details. Like, do you guys care about the details of how this is accomplished, or would you rather like cover like more sort of how things work, like at a much higher level, and cover more ground within the network stuff? More ground. Great. Love to hear that. Okay. So, let's talk a little bit about, you guys have probably heard the acronym HTLC thrown around? Yes or no? You don't, I mean, I'm just asking, have you heard the acronym thrown around and know roughly what it even represents? Okay, so this is like the actual fundamental payment primitive within the Lightning Network itself, and it is what because you might ask the question, like, okay, Alice, Bob, and Carol, I don't know why I keep erasing this, I just keep fucking drawing it. Alice, Bob, and Carol are all networked together like this. Alice wants to pay Carol. And a very reasonable question to ask about this setup is, how can I trust that Bob is not going to steal the payment mid-flight? It's like, okay, how can we deal with this? Because I can't just give Bob the money and then like just trust that he's going to forward it to Carol. Like, why would he? He would just, like, especially in an anonymous network where you don't actually know people. There's a lot of risk associated with doing that. Secondly, you might ask the question, okay, well, why can't Alice just request Bob pay Carol and be like, hey, you pay Carol, and if you pay Carol, I'll pay you? Because Bob has the same trust issue with Alice now, right? Because Bob can then front the money to Carol and then have no real guarantee from Alice about whether or not he's going to get reimbursed. So it's what we really want is some sort of construction that allows some linkage between a payment that happens here and a payment that happens there, right? And, ideally chained infinitely long if we need it to, because network topologies can get more complicated than this. So, it raises an interesting question. So I'm not going to burden you guys with having to think about how you might accomplish this, but rather what's going to end up happening is that Carol's basically going to say, hey, I have some secret, right? And I can hash that secret and give it to you out of band. Like, this is what you see in like invoices and QR codes and stuff like that. Are people familiar with what hashes are and why they're important? If you are not, this is not going to make any sense. So please raise your hand if you don't. Okay. All right. So if we hash the secret, send it to Alice. Alice now doesn't know the secret, but basically says like, hey, if you can reveal to me the secret. So like Alice says like, if you can reveal, like if you know S, then I'll pay you, Bob. And then Bob's like, okay, cool. And then otherwise, like if you can't tell me S in let's do this way. So condition 1 is reveal S, and you get it, or after T time, I get it back. So if we can somehow like encode into the Bitcoin rules this sort of contract, then if Alice offers this to Bob, she can rest assured that if Bob doesn't have this secret, that he won't be able to take her money. And similarly, Bob has some sort of guarantee that because as long as he reveals S before time T, he should be able to get it, no problem. So this is good for Bob. This actually gives Bob enough assurance that he can then now turn around and offer the exact same contract to Carol with the same exact S and hash and everything. And of course, so if we have those set up, then we have this what is, and I'll now say what the HTLC stands for. It's hashed, time locked, contract. HTLC. And the key being that the hash part is this condition 1, the time lock part is this condition 2, and the contract because like they're sort of bound together and it's an agreement between these people. So now if we have this HTLC set up, right, parameterized by S over here, and we have it here, then once Bob has offered this to Carol, remember that Carol knows S. So she can just terminate the whole contract with condition 1 and take her money. And in so doing, reveals S to Bob, who then takes S and does the same thing to Alice. And so the whole payment unwinds backwards. And this is really important. So when payments actually get set up, the contracts are offered forwards along the route, but they're resolved backwards along the route. So you can sort of imagine it kind of going, offered, and then resolved, and then resolved. I'm going to pause there. Any questions? As in, why does Bob want to do this? Like, why does Bob care? Yeah, great question. So this is getting into the how do we make money question. So it seems quite unreasonable that Bob would just do this because he feels like it. So the natural thing that we do in Bitcoin and any sort of business is to say, okay, Bob, if you do this, you can take a fee. And so the reality is that the contract that they're offering, the terms up here are still basically the same, but the amounts sort of bleed out over the course of the route. So the longer the route you have to construct, the more different intermediaries are involved in facilitating that payment, and each one will take a fee. And they get to set their own fees in the sense that they basically advertise what their fees are, and we can talk about, we'll talk about gossip much later, because there's a sort of question of just in general, it's like, how does anyone know what any of these parameters are? And we solve that very separately from just making the whole system work. So Bob basically advertises his fees, and Alice is just magically aware of that advertisement. And then Alice basically sets up this contract where embedded in, and I realize I skipped over a really important point here, but in this offered contract, she basically specifies the fee that she's willing to pay, and Bob basically either says, hey, yeah, I'm good with this, or no, this doesn't meet or exceed my advertisement, so I'm not going to, I'm just going to sort of bounce the payment backwards and return to sender. One of the important mechanisms that is used to guarantee the privacy and really the security of the networked aspect of this is that when Alice sends this envelope to Bob, she sends what's called an onion packet, which you can think of as, the first HTLC terms, and then like inside of that, there's this other packet, which has the HTLC terms for the second one, and so on down. And so in this scenario where we have this, and I'm going to draw this one vertically. And then, so if Alice is trying to pay all the way to Dave, she'll basically construct this packet in a way where she specifies HTLC 3 here, 2 here, and 1 here, and bundles this all up into a single packet such that Bob gets this packet, and when he decrypts it, he only knows what HTLC 1 is, and he just has to forward this entirely opaque blob onto the next person. So Bob, even though he's sort of like forwarding the information along the route that helps actually construct the entire route, he doesn't know what the whole route is. And this is a whole bunch of really fancy cryptography magic that I'm actually not sufficiently well versed in to get into the super details. Like, I knew how it worked at one point, but it's enormously complicated stuff. But the bottom line is that the net result of this mechanism is that the intermediate nodes only end up knowing where things came from and where they're going, and they don't know anything else. Questions?
So this is ABCD. Is there an average number of people that are involved in those transactions, would you say, or is there a maximum amount of people that can do those transactions?
There is a maximum, actually. There's a protocol-defined limit that you cannot do more than 20 hops. I think the reality is that like less than 1% of payments take more than like 4 hops. It's like there's this exponential curve. Like, there's a hard limit at 20, but like you can imagine you can reach more destinations the more hops you're willing to add, and at some point you've hit the whole network. And it's like it's definitely the official term for that is called the graph diameter, right? And that is either the median or the maximum number of hops in order to get from any two nodes to any other, or like the distance between an arbitrary number of nodes. And as far as I understand, like last I checked, for the Lightning Network, the graph diameter is like 7. So the headroom of 20 actually allows you to kind of do like loop payments if you want, like where you can sort of take circuitous routes to places. There's no real benefit to doing that because, as I stated with this like onion packet like opacity thing, it's like the privacy is good enough already that you don't need to like take needlessly long routes to get to like sort of lose your tail or something like that. But people experiment with doing it anyway because sometimes like circular rebalances, it can be useful to do that. What's up? Yeah, so that's a great question. So I did mention that Bob has the ability to bounce packets that he just like doesn't want to do. Like, he can actually bounce it for any reason, right? Like, generally speaking, the Lightning nodes, as long as the fees match, like all the terms of the HTLC match the sort of the user's constraints, then what will end up happening is that the node will just automatically accept it. But some people implement what is called like an HTLC interceptor. A lot of like big businesses, like any of your like Bitcoin companies that are running this infrastructure in their cloud, are going to have like this sort of this sort of dynamic analysis of HTLCs and decide whether or not to forward them in line. There's nothing you can do as the sender that is going to guarantee that any particular node is going to like help facilitate your payment, other than just sort of rely on the general incentives of the system and that you're gonna be able to find a route. So if Alice constructs, Carol, Dave. So let's say you have a network topology that looks like this, right? Where you have Alice, Bob, Carol, Dave. Alice wants to pay Dave. She has 2 options. She prefers Bob because Bob advertises cheaper rates. And so she tries to construct a packet, that does that. Bob bounces it, maybe because he just raised his fees, and like that information hadn't reached Alice yet when she decided to construct this packet. So she ends up getting it bounced back, and then what ends up happening is that because the HTLCs were canceled, because that's the other there's another way to terminate HTLCs. I had drawn the 2 conditions. There's forwards if they reveal the hash, backwards if the timeout happens. But if they both just collectively agree to eliminate the contract altogether, then they can do that. And again, that's because what's actually happening when this HTLC is offered is that, how I said that there's like a transaction that pays Alice and a transaction that pays Bob. There's actually a bunch of these like intermediate ones as well, which is for these like in limbo HTLCs that are in flight. And that's just because the conditions of that hash and that time are encoded in these outputs. And so with Bitcoin, it's done using mechanisms like check lock time verify, which is the time lock portion of it, and then like an op hash 256 op equal verify, which is like how they do the hash portion of the verification in Bitcoin script. So what ends up happening is that when they basically agree to a new channel state, they basically say, all right, invalidate the old transaction and then add, this, deduct, some n from Alice's balance and then put n in this like HTLC balance. And then vice versa. Like, if they decide that they want to cancel it, they can just be like, all right, let's just delete this output and then add it back to Alice's balance, and we're back in the original state. So if that happens, to answer the question of does it just collapse? Does it go to another Bob? It's like, once the HTLC is canceled back, Alice might decide, well, I still want to get this payment through. I'm still trying to get to Dave. Let me find another route in this graph and construct all of the gear in order to be able to get there. And it's the same exact process. All right. Any questions from there?
So just to clarify, all 4 of these people are part of the same channel?
No. Each one of these sort of double arrowed lines is a channel. They're all part of the same network. Yeah.
4 different channels, each established with a Bitcoin transaction.
Correct. Yes.
And so Alice has the ability to use the 2 channels, where she's choosing between the channels that she is able.
Yep. That's right. Exactly. And so in fact, one of the unfortunate limitations of the Lightning Network is that Alice has to decide the entire route herself, and this is to preserve the privacy. If, like, in other networking systems, like, TCP/IP, some of the stuff is, like, delegated, where you're saying, like, hey, I roughly know, like, I'm trying to get to this, like, side of the planet. I think this other spot that I definitely know is closer, and they'll know how to get to it just a little bit better than I can. And that's how, like, a lot of, packet switched routing happens around the internet. The trouble with that is that if you allow that kind of a mechanism, what ends up happening is that the intermediaries get insight into the original source and the final destination. We don't like that for privacy reasons. So as a result, Alice has to cram the information of the entire network state, at least to some approximation, into her head, really the computer's memory, and sort of compute a route that is optimal. And optimal is like a balance of a bunch of different dimensions. It's how cheap it is. It's like how likely it is to succeed, because maybe she's had experience where she pays this route and it like fails a lot. There's also a scenario where like maybe she's able to establish the HTLCs, right? And like they're on, but like for whatever reason, or really from Alice's view, she doesn't know if these are set up later, right? All she knows is like she just set up the one with Bob, and then she's just waiting for it to resolve. And so there are situations where Bob can hold on to this HTLC and not forward it because he's just being a dick or something like, or like, maybe he sets one up to Dave, and like, Dave is just like, if Dave has like a HODL invoice or something like that, I'm sure that's a term that gets thrown around, where, he's just waiting for like the actual fulfillment to happen in order for the actual to pull the payment. What ends up happening is that this HTLC sits on this channel for a really long time and ties up liquidity that can't be used in any other way, which really sucks. So Alice might want to take that into account. How long do these HTLCs live when I like choose these routes? Route selection is an extremely hard problem. There's no like optimal solution to it. Like all of the different node implementations play with different ways that they try to handle this. And so, it's kind of fun for people like me who work on this stuff to come up with newer and clever ways, but it does suck in that, like, it's kind of an annoying property of the network when it comes to using it. Yes. There is an exception to that, which is that negative fees were just introduced. And you might be like, why the fuck would someone want to have negative fees? Like, why would I want to pay money to people to have me route across these channels? The reason is that there's this annoying thing that happens in the Lightning Network that, if we have these bars, And let's say that it's all, you know, on Bob's side, right? Alice can't really pay Bob right now in this situation, right? He just doesn't have enough. Or sorry, she doesn't have enough. So she might have another channel, right, with Carol that looks like this. And she now can pay Carol, but she doesn't really have the ability to receive money from Carol. And in reality, even though it's the same amount of money, Alice's situation would look a lot better if it was like 50-50 on both of them, right? And that ends up meaning is that Alice in some way benefits from this situation a bit more. And we'll ignore a little bit about the fact that Bob and Carol's money is like a little bit different in these scenarios. There are ways to resolve that. But now Alice would rather have this situation than the one I outlined before. So if someone was basically using Alice, if Bob was trying to pay Carol through Alice or something like that, Alice would say, well, this actually improves my situation in terms of channel liquidity management, and it makes it easier for me to pay people. It makes it easier for me to receive from people. Or if I'm a router, it makes it just more likely that I can service more routes. Then I might advertise fees that help sort of correct that imbalance to sort of naturally let the network take care of this imbalance. So that's the only situation in which you would not see someone steadily taking a cut along the route, is if someone introduced negative fees. And the reason they would do that is this. In every other scenario, people want to make money, so they're going to set fees that are positive, and as long as every fee is positive, then on every hop, there's going to be a cut taken. All right. Any other questions? Every node on the route, so if you have A, B, C, D, right, then it's really the sum of the intermediaries. So in this case, you're going to have it's like B plus C plus D. And B sets, like Bob sets whatever B is, Carol sets whatever C is, Dave sets whatever D is. And so it's not really scaled in like a multiplicative sense. Like on average, it might look that way, but it's only because, you know, if Bob, Carol, and Dave are making the same decisions, then the sum of those components is going to look a lot like just multiplying it by 3. But the reality is that everybody's making their own individual economic decisions, and you're just paying the aggregate across the route. Yeah. So no, and the reason for that is that HTLC thing. So let's actually talk about what a real commitment transaction looks like. So this thing, it spends that channel point. Then it's got this first output that pays to Alice. And we're going to use a 10 Bitcoin channel. Just to make the math easy. I know that's like a fuck ton of money these days, but like... So it pays to Alice like 5, and then it pays to Bob 5, right? This is what a commitment transaction is. And so what a commitment transaction is it's basically like a signed like piece of evidence that you could like submit to a court, like all this is Bitcoin stuff. It's like there's no actual courts involved, but the blockchain functions as an adjudicator. You submit that transaction to the blockchain, and what ends up happening is it sort of pays out to the relevant parties. So for any of these situations where we are saying like, okay, we want to update channel state, Alice wants to be able to pay Bob, whether it's in order to pay someone way down the line or not, ultimately Alice is offering this HTLC, parameterized by S of 1. Okay, so this is the situation you're asking. It's like, okay, now because remember, Alice is not paying Bob unless Bob can sort of prove that Bob paid Carol in this like change network sense. So that S, that payment secret that Bob learns in that process, is going to be that evidence that he paid Carol, which allows him to resolve this. In this situation, before that S is revealed, this is what the commitment transaction looks like. Alice has 4. This HTLC S, and then also like, there's a T in here. And Bob gets 5. So if this goes to chain, Alice can immediately take her 4. Bob can immediately take his 5. And then after this time lock expires, Alice is going to be able to take this 1 back as well. Now, it's annoying because she has to wait that time, but Bob has no other way to claim this money than to reveal S. And the only way he can reveal S is if someone downstream revealed it to him, and you take that enough steps, and it eventually means that the actual intended recipient gets their funds. Sam. Like on chain? Like what does chain resolution look like? Or, okay, yeah, so this is the offer step, is that Alice basically said, hey, add one of these to the commitment transaction. Both of them do this signing dance, which literally in the LND code is sometimes called a dance, fun fact. And so now Bob off-chain is like, hey, Alice, I know the secret. Here, like, here's what it is. And of course, him revealing it to Alice, assuming that Alice is the original sender, doesn't actually harm anything. But now both of them know that if it were to go to chain, that Bob will get it anyway. And so they both kind of know how this dispute would resolve if it came to a dispute. And so what ends up happening is that now Bob and Alice, given this reveal of S, decide, hey, we're just going to erase this. We're going to sign a new transaction that involves a 6 on Bob's side and a 4 on Alice's. So every time a payment is made over a channel, let's say that you have a transaction 1, which is 5, 5. You have transaction 2, which has 4, 1, 5. And then you have transaction 3, which is 4, 6. In the process of making this payment, the commitment transaction, so the way that you encode channel state into a Bitcoin transaction, is going to pass through all of these. It'll start here, it'll stop here briefly, and ideally, assuming the payment resolves, will end up here. And if the payment times out because they ran out, like the time lock expired, then they both can sort of have that same conversation where it's like, well, we know how this is going to end. Like you still don't know S. I can close the channel right now and take my funds back. So how about we both avoid that process because it's like messy. It'll cost us both, and then we'll just have to like recommit funds to channels. So like, why don't we skip all of that and go to the very end where we just reset the channel state back to 5.5. Okay. Yes. Yeah. So the actual, and I don't think it seems like I don't think that this might be the forum to talk about the detailed intricacies of like how the channel update process works, although we can if people want to. This is probably one of the hardest parts of the Lightning Network to understand. But basically there is a set of messages exchanged, right, between Alice and Bob that involve them like agreeing on moving from here to here. And there's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 messages that have to get exchanged just to do one step here. So that is, the channel update process. If you want to know more about that, painfully, this is actually all specified in Bolt 2. So all of the Lightning Network specifications are public open source. You can read them online. You can know everything that there is to know about how the system works from just reading those documents. They're really specific and hard to read, but ultimately complete. And yeah, that stuff's specified in Bolt 2. This transaction stuff, well, I can actually quickly go through this, is in Bolt 3. I actually specifically did this in order. This is Bolt 4, this is Bolt 5. So the onion stuff that I was talking about, those envelopes, those are like nested envelopes can be seen in 4. How we try to resolve things on chain is its own specification for like recommendations on how to react to chain events in a way that keeps your funds safe. And when I say react, it's like this is your node software reacting. You as a user don't have to think about this at all. It would be a real pain in the ass if you did. Yeah, I'm gonna try to restate your question, and you can tell me if I'm getting at what you're actually interested in. There seems to be this, like, if we had these old transactions of these old states, like what happens to them after they expire? Like what happens after they're no longer the current state? Do I have to keep them? Do I have to forget them? The short answer is that there's a very small piece of data that linearly grows with the number of updates of the channel. So the weight of the bookkeeping of a channel does get heavier over the channel's lifetime. It's not very much because it's only about 32 bytes worth of information per channel update, which is like, all things considered, like you go through 1,000 updates and you'd be less than 1 memory page size. Like it's very, very like small. But it does grow unbounded. Like for as long as that channel is alive, you're gonna have to keep storing 32 bytes every fucking time, and it's really annoying. If you people have heard of the horribly named L2, ELTOO, or also known as like LN symmetry, I know that's been discussed here before. The main pitch of that improvement proposal for Lightning is to get rid of that problem. And actually, there's two. There's that one, and then to get rid of the punishment mechanism, which we haven't talked about at all. But it would make it such that you only had to store the most recent state, and you could basically forget about all the previous states, which would take the bookkeeping from O of n to O of 1, which would be really nice. But that requires changes to the Bitcoin base layer protocol, which people argue about endlessly, and we are currently in the midst of another argument about it. Although, fingers crossed that we'll get check sig from stack and CTV. So. Yeah. How does Strike work? So Strike's a bank. That's the short answer. But it's like a big. Yeah. Yeah, so what ends up happening, so you have this network topology, and we'll actually just rename the parties here. We have space. We have, gosh, like what, Bcash is trash is like an actual one. There might be like BFX LND0 or something like that. And then I think strikes are named strike or something like that. So when you pay with Strike, like what ends up getting presented to you is an invoice, right? Like an LN invoice. The invoice is like raw Bitcoin Lightning Network protocol stuff. So Strike is actually speaking native protocol language. And whatever translation is happening here is like just a trust relationship that you have with Strike. And vice versa. So if you present an invoice from Strike, you want to get paid on Strike. Strike just issues an invoice, and it talks all this like native Bitcoin, or like this native like Lightning protocol stuff. So the space pays it, and then that last hop between the Strike node and whatever your balance is on Strike is handled using a like really dumb Web 2 technology that does database stuff that keeps track of who is owed what. And, if I recall, like Strike also sort of allows you to get paid dollars in this way. And so like that last mile like conversion to dollars will also happen via that trust relationship. All right. What time is it? I've just been 7:41. We have plenty of time. We're only an hour in. Yeah, I think we're just this Q&A format is gonna work. Do people like this sort of like just throw a question out and have me answer it in super detail and just keep marathoning that? Because that's my favorite format. All right, then like yeah, we can keep going with that. Next question.
Random question.
Yeah.
Maybe off topic, but what's your favorite point?
It's kind of insane that it works at all. Actually, like it's wild. Because especially the more you learn about it, the more you realize like just how much is going on. Because I've talked, maybe you've heard me talk about it and you're like, man, that's a lot. I have elided so much information. It's unreal. Like, we were talking about that channel update process, right? Taking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 messages minimum. Like that whole thing and managing all the state inside to do that is like insane. Then that's just for one channel update, right? Then you've got all these hops. Like now after that channel update succeeds, you then have to forward the entire packet again, which involves like unwrapping one layer of the thing, taking the insides out, and then setting up another one of those there. Do that for 7 hops. Then the person at the very end like reveals a secret. Now to sort of unwind those contracts, all of this happens again, the other direction. And all of this happens in like a handful of seconds, right? It's not like quite instant. It's not the same instantaneous payment experience you have with a lot of stuff right now. It takes long because of all of this that's happening. And of course, like, even with just the process of sending these messages, like there's like, cryptography happening in terms of signatures and validation and, verification of the hashes and stuff like that, all happening in line during that process. And so like after I started to like work on it for real, like I just had a much bigger appreciation for like if payment, like a lot of people get upset. They're like, oh, my payment's not working. And it's like, you know what, as a user, you should be demanding that's how we make the technology better. But the more that I worked on it, I was like, I'm just amazed this works at all. But yeah, I would say, and then like just some of the interactions with like how the Bitcoin base layer stuff works, like, with the addition of Taproot, like it's still, a couple of years out, but the Taproot optimizations on channels are just really cool from like a math standpoint. It means that like the whole system gets like a little bit more private. It ends up being cheaper to run, but at the expense of like even more complicated shit happening at the upper layer. So. The main reason that I'll talk about this from the user experience perspective. Like the main reason, the main way that a user is going to experience it breaking is like a payment failure. They're going to try to they're going to like scan an invoice, and then something's going to happen and says like, we can't make this payment. And the reason that happens a lot is because ultimately, Alice could not find a route all the way, to Dave. And the reason is that, like, the more of these hops you have, the more opportunities there are for failure, right? Like, because any one of these breaking down is going to prevent the entire payment circuit from forming, and so the whole thing's never going to get, like, finished, set up all the way to tear down. And so the longer the route, the more unstable it is. Secondly, the issue is that in order for this to succeed, Alice might have, let's say it's like 10-0, but this is like 5-5, and this is like, 4-6. So Alice might think that she can send 10 Bitcoin to Dave, but she can't, because she'll push, like, she'll push 10 out to Bob, right, in this contract. So let's say that, but then Bob's gonna get this packet and be like, I can't actually offer Carol 10 because I don't have 10 to offer on this channel. I only have 5. And so, it'd be nice maybe if Bob could sort of communicate that back to Alice and be like, hey, if you, like, I can service part of this payment, but not the whole thing. Like maybe lower this down to 5 and try again. we don't really have the mechanism to do that right now. There's nothing fundamentally preventing that. It's just a bunch of engineering work that hasn't gotten done yet. But Alice, can't pay 10, and so as a result, like you might imagine that the larger the payment gets, the more likely it is to fail. For that same reason, is that now there's more opportunities for whatever is being sent to like blow through the capacity constraints of any particular hop along the network. Other reasons that might fail is like if Bob or Carol recently increased their fees, then and like that information hadn't been communicated back to Alice properly, then she won't offer the right fees. Payments will fail. Now, many payment attempts will fail, but the whole payment from the user experience may not, because when a payment attempt fails, it will like cascade to multiple different things that it tries in the background, and that will result in the user experience a longer payment time, but ultimately successful if they can find a route that happens. But everything comes down to, the atomic failure that happens, right, is like whether or not the node is online and can actually service moving those funds between the one side of the channel and the other. And then the more of those you stack in series, the more likely it fails, and then the larger the payment, the more likely it fails, and then if you run out of options, then the whole thing fails. Yeah, let's talk about gossip. Yeah, so gossip really handles a couple of things. Number one is that it handles knowing about the existence of channels, because you might imagine, like, how do I even know that there's a channel to begin with to use? And so what ends up happening is that once this channel, like the money has been deposited into this channel point, so like you can think about the channel point as being like a joint account between the two sides of the channel. So if you have like Alice and Bob, they both sort of jointly own this channel point. And so, you'll say like, hey, this channel point can be thought of as like a channel ID. We can basically advertise its existence and say, like, hey, at this location, there is a channel. It's got like, 10 Bitcoin in it. It belongs to Alice and to Bob. Alice's fees are, one thing. Bob's fees are well, that's actually not in the channel announcement. That's part of the channel update message. But basically, a bunch of other like metadata about the channel gets included in this message. They both sign it, and then they just chuck it into the ether. And then other nodes that are, but by chucking it into the ether, you might have Bob, is talking to Carol, but maybe, and then Alice is talking to Dave. Maybe they are talking to each other, and maybe there's like another Eve out here. The point is that gossip messages just get relayed everywhere. Like if you hear about something, you forward it on to the next person so that they know. And so roughly within, single to double digit seconds, the network should be aware of the new state. There's a lot of things that can interfere with this, and it's hard to know whether it's being interfered with. Like there's no way to know whether or not you missed a gossip message, really, other than your payments fail, but your payments can fail for reasons that have nothing to do with gossip, right? If there's just no liquidity on the side of the channel that you're expecting. So yeah, that's the channel announcement, and then there's like a second one. There's like a node announcement message, which sort of announces to the network, like, hey, I'm a new node. This only gets relayed if a channel gets opened. So fun fact is that if you just set up a node and you have no channels, the rest of the network has no idea you exist. You have to open up one channel for the rest of the network to be aware of your existence. I saw a hand go up. Yeah. Lose via theft or lose via loss, like, nuking it. I'm going to say basically no to theft, you know, there obviously if someone can like hack into the computer itself that is running this shit, then like they can kind of control it as if they were you, and in that sense, like you can get it stolen. But from like a protocol risk standpoint, the answer is basically no. You can't do that, but there's like a million ways to lose your funds by just like nuking it. Like if you delete the hard drive, like all those funds are gone. Like even if you backed up the seed, I think someone was gonna ask about backups. Backups are, I'll defer that. We will talk about it. It is important. But yeah, if you can also lose your funds if you restore from a backup that was like too old, but not like, yeah, if it wasn't current. And we haven't really talked about this much either, and so maybe let's briefly stop off on this, which is that, okay, so a channel state is encoded into a Bitcoin transaction, right? And it pays to Alice and Bob, and once that channel state is signed, or like this transaction is signed, it's kind of just valid forever, right? And so even if I create another one, right, it looks exactly like this, and so let's call this 10, or whoops, 5, and like we have another one later that pays out the same, but like Alice has 4 and Bob has 6, right? Like this second channel state is more favorable to Bob than to Alice, comparatively. So like Alice kind of has an incentive to try to close the channel or like submit this transaction because she has one more Bitcoin in this scenario than she does in this scenario. So why doesn't she do that? Like, because the transaction's valid, right? And the reason is that Alice's copy of this transaction actually has certain conditions. It has, she has to wait, let's say like 144 blocks, which is a day, I think. And there's also this like special secret that if Bob knows, Bob can just take all the money. So like what this, instead of it saying, okay, pay to Alice with 5, let's actually talk about the contract conditions here. So Alice can have this after, like A gets, after, like just arbitrarily call it 144. A gets it after 144, or B gets if reveal S. It's very similar to that HTLC. But the difference is that this S now, in order for us to progress from this channel state to this channel state, one of the parts of that process is Alice will tell Bob what S is. And in so doing, now if Alice ever submits this transaction to chain, Bob just instantly takes all of the money by revealing S. And so now, even though this transaction is valid, because Alice is the only one with a copy of it, Alice will never submit it because she's just going to lose the money, because she's already given the secret out that would cause her to lose it. And so Bob has a mirror image of that transaction that does the same thing, and they both sign each other's, and that's how that works. So why is this relevant to how do I lose money? Well, it's like, well, this is a way that you can lose money. Now, if everything works properly, you'll never hit this condition. But one of the nasty things that can happen is that if you save all of the state, like you clone the hard drive of a node, it's going to have all these transactions in it, right? It'll have the most, at the minimum, it'll have the most recent transaction in it that represents the channel state at that time. Now, let's say you clone that hard drive, you put it in storage somewhere, and then you continue using the thing, and you advance from this channel state to this channel state. Your cloned hard drive still thinks that this is reality. And so if you ever try to restore that node from that hard drive, and then you close the channel, you're going to submit this transaction to chain, but Bob is going to remember S, because that's the piece of information that gets stored for all time. It's that secret that says, like, yeah, this is how I get out of this. This is basically how I punish my counterparty for cheating. So, yeah, you can definitely lose all your money in these situations where you clone something to a hard drive naively. Now, there's ways to do backups that are safe, and the instructions in the Node software is much more going to be much more helpful than what I'll provide here. But you do have to follow this safely. A naive cloning of your hard drive will get you absolutely ganked. Like, do not do that. Yeah, that would be the net result. Yeah, like in this scenario, because Bob gets it if he reveals S, this goes to Bob, and this ends up going to Bob, even though it would normally go to Alice. And it's like just in this window for 144 blocks. Now, hypothetically, if for whatever reason, like the mempool was so jammed that like Bob couldn't get this in time, after 144 blocks, they might try to race to see if they can get the transaction through. And so that's another thing, is that all of the security of pretty much any layer 2 system, Lightning, any of it, most of it hangs on the ability to get your transactions confirmed in a timely manner. And so in a timely manner, right? Because if this transaction gets submitted to chain and then it like locks in, then this timer starts for 144 blocks. And then if for whatever reason Bob can't get his sort of his transaction that claims that sort of punishment money from this output faster than 144 blocks, then he has to race Alice for it. And weird games can play out in like mempool fee dynamics that can cause loss of funds. But generally speaking, if the mempool is decently, like if it's not insane, like pretty much the last time I remember it being crazy was like in the aftermath of the halving, then like the software is intelligent enough to deal with even like moderate fee pressure and still win these things properly. Bob does have to be on guard, on watch all the time. I don't know how that pertains to the first part of your question, but because Alice could hypothetically submit this at any time, even way into the future, long after it's valid, because Bob's only recourse is to punish by revealing S, Bob has to be eternally vigilant. And so if you've ever heard of Lightning Network watchtowers, it's a way to sort of outsource this vigilance task. And they have, they're a useful construction to have, but I wouldn't rely on them because their incentives are never going to be as good as your own. But it does mean that, yeah, keeping your Lightning network, your Lightning node online is really important in order to preserve the safety of your funds. Yes, but like I think if you read that sentence back to yourself, you'll understand how weird that sounds, which is that if Bob is offline, he has to be vigilant, but Bob has to be online to be vigilant. So it's the real answer here is don't go offline. Now, the cool thing is that because those watchtowers exist, because there is a way to outsource it, even if the incentives aren't great, it means that if Alice notices that Bob's offline, because Alice can know that, right? Alice can just know if Bob stops responding to requests, and she can be like, all right, he's not watching. Maybe I can like cheat him or something. But what Alice doesn't know is if Bob has sort of his like watchtower situation configured. And so Alice doesn't want to lose all of her money. And so she's like, I don't know if he's covered or not, but I'm not willing to bet 4 Bitcoin on the fact that he's not, right? Because I'm not just like, because keep in mind, Alice's benefit for the benefit that she gets from ignoring this transaction and submitting this one is 1 Bitcoin, right? Like she rightfully owns 4 Bitcoin in this channel, and she's trying to get 5 out of it. So she's really stealing 1 Bitcoin, but she's putting 4 Bitcoin at stake to do that. And so like the incentives are very much can be really not in your favor to do that. Now, hypothetically, you can imagine a scenario though where a previous channel state looked like 10-0 because she opened the channel. And then she shoved all the money to the other side, and now she's got 0-10. Now it's like, well, now if I lose, it's like I'm no worse off, right? So that actually reveals another important point, which is that Lightning channels can never be completely drained on either side, with the exception of the very beginning and you're on the remote side. So if Alice opens a 10 Bitcoin channel to Bob, it'll all be on Alice's side. But the moment that even 10 10 million sats, 1% of the channel balance goes to the other side, neither side will ever be lower than 1% ever again. And it's to prevent this nothing at stake problem. It's to make sure that if you're going to try to steal money, that you have money to lose by trying that. I think these days you can get away with setting about a Bitcoin over Lightning simultaneously, but it's going to be like, I think the stats that I saw on this is like it's an exponential drop off, right? So for like every doubling of the size, it's going to be like probably less than half of the probability that it's going to go through. But I think you could but given the number of different options that you have, like I don't think it really starts to get in your way until like, you know, right around a Bitcoin. The largest channels on the network, as far as I know, are like maybe 5 Bitcoin. That's a good question for 1 ML. While I sort of search that, what's the other one? That is a wonderful question. The answer I have for that is it's not a silver bullet, and it's like so when you say is this the technology, I'm broadly interpreting that to be is the Lightning Network, right? Maybe we're on version X right now, maybe X plus 50 of the Lightning Network gets us there. Like the current version just it won't, and it's just, but there's like a lot of known improvements in the pipeline that will make it better, much better. There's also, when I was in Tokyo last September discussing this with like a bunch of the other like creators of Lightning, there was one guy, Rene Picard. I don't know if people are familiar with his work. He does a lot of really like mathy analytical stuff with respect to understanding how the theory of the Lightning Network behaves. And he actually shared some rather disappointing results about how it scales. Is that it scales much worse than naively you assume. And it's not necessarily that it can't take us to being a medium of exchange. Like it can absolutely support massive transaction volumes and like big payment sizes and stuff. But the trade-off ends up being that the capital requirements required to run the network at that scale are really bad, in that like you have to just commit enormous amounts of capital to these channels, and you might not be able to make use of all of it at the same time. And so it's not a question of whether or not we can service the payment volumes that are needed. Like that stuff is pretty good. It's like, are we going to be able to stomach the capital requirements to do so? Yeah, it's going to come down to what the expected return on capital is, right? And if this is just not a productive use of capital, then people are not going to do it. And if they don't do it, then the users don't have the payment rails to be able to do the payment volumes and stuff. So it's complicated, and I'm not going to get into the details of that paper because it makes some really like weird, like high-dimensional algebraic arguments for why this is the case. But it is definitely the case that as the network grows, the capital requirements to keep the same relative payment sizes alive are much worse than they would be otherwise. But to sort of pop up a level of that question is that like, I think the Lightning Network is here to stay. Just because it has these like really nasty properties regarding like the capital requirements doesn't make it a useless technology. It just means that it on its own is probably not going to be like causing villages in Africa to be able to pay, merchants in Europe for, this, that, or the other thing. I think the absolute worst case scenario for Lightning at this point is it's an interbank settlement protocol for like Bitcoin-based financial institutions. And disappointing as that may sound for the cypherpunks in the room, I think it's a huge win for the technology still. Like, I don't think that having that mechanism it's definitely not any worse than the banking system is today, and I think it's a hell of a lot better, and it uses like Bitcoin rails to begin with, but it may not be like your sort of peer-to-peer electronic cash vision on its own. But again, anything that takes payment pressure off of the base layer helps free up other mechanisms with other trust assumptions and other designs to share chain space and not like have to really fight for like tons of like fees for inclusion. And so it's all very good. Like Lightning definitely scales Bitcoin. How far it will scale Bitcoin and like what use cases it will ultimately allow at that scale is like a open question, and we'll kind of see that play out over the next 10 to 50 years.
Just following up on that, so it's logical conclusion for the newbies out there, right? Who are trying to get on. First of all, I'll just say, okay, so really the max that you're trying to transact, you got to have that in all the channels somewhere in order to make that flow. So that's really the limitation you're working on, right? Is really the smallest, right? The smallest value in the circuit chain.
Yeah. Yeah, so the stability of that is definitely related to whatever the largest or the smallest link in that chain is going to break the large payment. What's cool though is that you can break up large payments into small chunks and pay them across multiple routes simultaneously. And so you can still get big payment flows through the network. It just might be more expensive than the naive assumption would allow you to make.
I'm actually thinking about the other side of that, though, which is like most transactions are just small little things that people
Yes.
trying to handle, right?
Yep.
And that's what we're doing with the newbies, but it always involves setting up a channel.
Yes.
Right? So every newbie's got to go through that hurdle. You got to get your wallet. You got to get a.
Yep.
You got to create a channel. I'm just trying to see if there's any way to get somebody using this without putting them through all of that education and all of that infrastructure. And as a way in, I'm just confirming that that's simply not true.
It's mostly not true. I mean, so so on some level, you can't send money to someone else if you've never received it, right? So it's reasonable to say, hey, if a user doesn't have any money, they shouldn't be able to send any money. So that part is normal. What sucks, I think, is to say, well, if you don't have any money, you should be able to receive money, right? It's like, I don't have any money in my wallet, but I have a wallet, like, just take my money. And unfortunately, you still need a channel for that. And that's the really annoying part. There are wallets out there. Phoenix is the one that comes to mind, but I think Moon and there's one other that is coming to mind, that is escaping me right now, that have this sort of property where you can sort of pay the wallet before it has a channel. And what will end up happening is it will just, like, at sort of just in time, allocate a channel to that last mile the first time that it's paid. The trust assumptions for that are slightly different than the rest of the network. And so as a result, the people who are in like my typical line of work don't look at that as like the same level of security. But the reality is that, like, okay, if you're receiving, you know, $10 worth of Bitcoin or something like that for the first time, it's like, do you really need these like insane security requirements? The answer is no. And then, like, once the channel is established, it behaves the rest of it, like the rest of it. So I would look into Phoenix. I would look into MUUN, Moon. Yeah. There are probably more. Maybe other people in this room know them as well. Like, most of my expertise is in like the core technology stuff and less so in like the wallets. So I'm sure that there are many people in this room too who could, like, it's definitely worth asking around on the sort of more user-centric options. Lightning has, I think, the most secure posture of any second layer that I have seen the design for. And so that ends up, and what it is that even though Lightning doesn't really give us peer-to-peer electronic cash in the sense that every human on Earth is connected to this like network and everyone's equal in that way, it is peer-to-peer in the sense that no one is in charge of the Lightning network, right? It is like every node on the network behaves like qualitatively exactly the way that every other node behaves. And so everyone is on an equal playing field in that way. Yes, there are people who like have larger payment volumes, larger channels, et cetera, but they don't have any better security than the smallest nodes on the network. And so as a result, it's a very peer-to-peer technology. Contrast that with something like eCash, where there's the mint runner itself. And yeah, all of the people who that mint runner is servicing might have equal standing with each other, but the mint runner kind of has a different security posture there that the other ones don't. And so it ends up not feeling like, from an interop perspective, it's like not the protocol you would want to use. And then the stuff that I work on right now with the BitVM and like bridges, right? The nodes that help facilitate that bridge, those operators have a level of privilege that like is not permissionless. Like you can't just walk in and be like, I want to be an operator of a BitVM bridge. It just doesn't work that way. But yes, the technology is open source. Yes, you could launch your own bridge with your own parameters and like be an operator for that. But ultimately, there's sort of known privileged, but not necessarily trusted actors in some of these other models. And Lightning doesn't have that. And I'd say that that is probably the thing that stands out to me the most as to why Lightning tends to be the off-chain interoperability layer. At the end of the day, Bitcoin is the actual interoperability layer because everything settles to L1. But to the extent that you can and don't want, to the extent that you don't want to settle on L1 and that you can settle on L2, on some L2 at all, Lightning is like one of the most natural choices, at least for now. Like, I'm not ruling out the idea that we find better designs, but the nice thing about the Lightning construction is that it is like peer-to-peer at the very, like, at its most fundamental level, right? It's a bilateral contract. It's just you and me. There's no one else. I hold all my data that is required to keep this secure. You hold all your data that requires to keep this secure. There are no third parties required in order to keep this secure. And as long as everybody has their own incentives in mind, then everybody ends up like sort of taking care of their own corner of the network, and it ends up being pretty robust in that regard. Any other questions? Let me also consult my list and see if. Are you actually talking about Liquid specifically, or are you talking about the notion of sidechains in general? So sidechains are interesting. So if we generalize sidechain to like side system, then that's pretty much exactly the stuff that I'm working on right now at Alpen. The main difference between kind of like what we're doing at Alpen and like what Liquid does is really just like the types and the amount of the trust assumptions to like in that bridge. Because ultimately, like the security of a side system bridge depends on the guarantee that for every like coin that I lock up on L1, only one coin is available on L2, and that at some point I can destroy that coin on L2 and get it back on L1, right? Or sorry, when I say L2, I mean like this on this side chain or the side system. As long as that two-way peg holds, the system is secure. And as long as you can do that without having to ask someone else's permission, then you're considered to be in custody of your own funds, right? And so the trust assumptions involved in Liquid are that like 11 of the 15 signatories have to behave properly. Whereas in the BitVM bridge stuff that I work on now, it's like 1 of the 15 signatories has to behave properly. And like that's a much better situation, right? If only one of them has to be honest, like you can be much more sort of safe than having to like worry if 11 of them have to agree. So the downside of side chains in general is that like blockchains, like the actual data structure that we use to do all this shit on layer 1, like it's terrible. Like it almost anti-scales, right? It's that as you add more nodes to the system, it just gets more expensive to run and doesn't give you any better throughput. And so in that sense, side chains can't scale Bitcoin any better than the main chain could because they are subject to all of the same constraints. But there's nothing that requires the side system to be a blockchain. The blockchain is a great choice for the trust dynamics in L1 because of like proof of work, permissionlessness, the ability to like reconstruct the chain from just looking at it as opposed to like having to, bless certain public keys to be able to sign new blocks and stuff. So the more you're willing to, compromise certain aspects of like permissionlessness or something like that in that side system, you can recover certain scalability properties. And that's, in my opinion, that's very okay for certain allocations of funds. Like you might not put your life savings in a system where that requires like more trust, but you'd absolutely put like pocket change or like a bank account worth, right? Where you only had to trust one of 15 people to behave properly. So it's like depending on the use case for the money, you're willing to make certain trade-offs in terms of trust and security, and then also the accessibility of those funds and the sort of usability of those funds. So changing the channel, changing the channel capacity at all requires something called a splice. So you can either splice money in or you can splice money out. At the highest level, they use the same protocol. The details are slightly different, right? Like because these are Bitcoin transactions, if you want to add money to it, you need to add another input, right? If you want to take money out of it, maybe you use the same input and you add another output. It sort of just pays off to some, like if Bob has 5 and wants to withdraw 2, you just sign another one of these where he, takes another 2 off to some other output that he controls completely, and then, go on their merry way. So.
You create a channel, Bob and Alex are both depositing.
So that's one option. So typically, no, actually. When we open a channel, it's not that it can't work that way. It's just that it doesn't for the most part. The initial channel state in the vast majority of cases is going to be in this, repeated use of this 10 Bitcoin channel that I'm talking about. It's going to be all with 10 on Alice's, or it's going to be with all 10 on Alice's side. And from then on, like Bob is a participant in this process in the fact that he signs it, but his initial signature is going to have him getting paid 0. And so his output won't actually exist on that transaction. So it'll actually only be one of these, right? But as soon as he gets money, as soon as Alice pays him off chain and they sign new transactions, then he'll have an output that looks like this. And then it'll just go back and forth forever. And then when they close it, they, submit that transaction and then they get their funds back and everyone's happy. Okay, so a node can I think the analogy that's most helpful is that a node is thought of as a person and a channel is thought of as a contract, right? You as a person can have a contract with as many different people as you want. You can have as many contracts with the same person as you want. The contracts all behave independently, right? So Alice can have multiple channels with Bob, right? But also have, a channel with Carol. But to answer the other question that you had sort of snuck in there as well is that each channel can only have 2 nodes. It's got one party on one side, one party on the other side. That's it. It's only ever 2. This can have as many channels as they want, with as many people as they want, including multiple channels with the same person. Let's see. Let me briefly look at. We've covered this. I don't think we need to cover that. But okay, yeah. So someone asked about the situations what about where you want to deposit 5 on here and 5 on here to start, right? You want to start the channel off in this balanced way. And I said yeah, it doesn't really happen that way. It's not that it can't, it's just that it doesn't, and it's because the UX of it is much easier to be hey, I have a bunch of money in my node on the chain wallet. Let me just load it into a channel, and I don't need to negotiate anything complicated with my counterparty, and it just happens. However, if Alice could sort of get Bob to agree to put 5 Bitcoin in that channel to start, then hypothetically they can both sign those outputs and create the channel point, right, that they're dropping it into. They both contribute, 5 here and 5 there, right? And then it goes into, there's an intermediate transaction in here, but it'll end up paying back out to Alice and Bob with 5 and 5, right? And the process by which that happens is called dual funding, and it's just a more complicated setup process when the initial channel is getting created, because both parties have to contribute their funds, swap signatures with each other, and like agree on what's actually happening. Whereas when it's unilateral, where it's just like Alice putting in 10 or Alice putting in 5 or whatever amount that she wants to put in, there's nothing to negotiate. Bob's just like, hey, do you want this channel or not? And Bob's like, probably yeah, let's do it. I think the reality of the situation is like, yeah, that seems just as good in practice. There was a while for which that wasn't true because C Lightning took many years to implement what we call parallel channels, this idea that Alice and Bob can have multiple channels between them. L&D had it from the start, but C Lightning could, for a long time, could only have one channel per counterparty. And so in that scenario, like literally the only way that you could get this done is by like doing this dual funding process. So like, but yeah, this ends up being just as effective in practice. It's slightly more expensive chain fees than it would be in like a dual funding scenario, but the UX of the dual funding is like much more complicated, and the cost of like the chain fee cost of doing it this way is like fairly small. You're not saving a ton. Like if we get the user experience much better, and I think we're well on our way to doing that. Like again, that's one of those things where the reality is that it's just engineering work that hasn't been done yet, and as it gets done, like that delta will decrease, and maybe one day you'll just be like, yeah, of course I'm going to dual fund everything, I'm going to splice everything. Like I'm only ever going to have one channel with a given counterparty, because that's the most sensible thing to do when you consider all of the different facets of the costs that you're paying, whether that's like chain costs or headache cost or like just UX weirdness. It's not opposite. There's talk about trying to change that property. Yes. So yeah. In order to get into this, we have to talk a little bit about how fees work in the commitment transactions themselves. So I don't want a channel bar. I want like a transaction. So you've got the channel point, right? You've got your Alice payment. You've got your Bob payment, right? Let's say that there's 10 in the channel point. You've got your 5. You got your 5. How do the miners get paid in this scenario? They don't, which is a problem. So this is never going to get confirmed. So ultimately, Alice or like somebody needs to give up a little bit of Bitcoin in order for this to have enough fees to even make it into the mempool. Now, the cool thing ends up being that people realize that if you've heard of child pays for parent, it's this like property of transactions where if I have this thing, it's called an anchor output. That's my really terrible anchor drawing. Like anybody, or if you knew how to spend this anchor output, then if you had a transaction that essentially did that, and you paid like really high fees on this one, then miners will recognize that, realize that, oh, in order to get this transaction to confirm, we have to actually also confirm this one as well, and that'll like force this to confirm. And so for the most part, fees for closing channels are deferred to close time. Like we don't even think about them for the most part. However, if you still don't have to have enough fees in this transaction at all in order for it to hit the min relay fee limit or something like that, like which I think is 1 sat per byte in order for it to get relayed at all. That's currently changing. Like there's talks about something like stuff at the layer 1 level called like pay to anchor, which will make some of this even easier. But the point is that this transaction has to carry some amount of fee. Even if it's not enough to pay for its like confirmation at the current time, it just needs to be enough for it to get relayed around the network. So this number cannot be exactly the sum of those numbers. So what ends up happening is that whoever opens the channel actually ends up paying whatever, like I think 5 sat or per byte minimum for this transaction. And it just comes out of their balance from the start. So whoever opens it pays it on the commitment fees. Now, if you cooperatively close the channel, which doesn't involve submitting these pre-signed transactions that we have, but you just sort of just in time agree to them, then whoever's trying to close it ends up paying the fee. They just say like, hey, please close this channel with me cooperatively, and I'm willing to pay this much for it. And the other person's like, yeah, sure. Like, if I don't have to pay for it, go for it. Yes. In the cooperative case, yes. The opener still pays the fee in the disputed, when you submit the commitment transactions. These sort of like force close, yeah. So when you're looking at the actual node software, what is called a force close is submitting of this pre-signed transaction every time channel state updates. The cooperative close is saying like, hey, this is like our current channel state. You and I both know what that is. How about we like save ourselves all the fees associated with keeping this contract alive and just like cooperatively sign something that pays the same results. And then we'll just like, basically, it's basically like saying, yo, you and I have this dispute. We can both read the contract and say like, hey, we know how this is gonna turn out. So like, let's skip the lawyers, not pay their fees, and like just get this done. And in most cases, people will be like, yeah, that's right. Like multi-party channels, like 3 people being in a channel? Yeah. So let's briefly talk about what multi-party channels are, because they don't, yeah, kind of. And I'm sorry I'm doing that to you guys where I'm saying like, sort of, it depends, but that's the reality. But I will try to simplify it as best I can. So because these things are just transactions and they can have outputs, like there's no reason that you can't have a channel point with 15 in it and then have like, you know, a third output that has 5, right? Like there's nothing at the Bitcoin level preventing this from happening. The trouble is that in order to get this to happen, because they all have a claim on some of these funds, in order to keep that secure, they all would hypothetically have to sign this input. You can't just use 2 of them to sign this input, because then those 2 could collude to cut the third one out. So they all need to be party to that signature. So that increases the interactivity requirements every time you like try to update channel state, because now you have to get 3 signatures, and if any one of them is offline, it'll prevent channel state from updating. So you can imagine how that scales, right? So like if you go from 2 to 3 to 15 to 100, like a 100-person channel is going to be like way more unstable than a 2-person channel. And if you can't update channel state at all, like you can't route payments, you can't send payments, you can't receive payments. So there's like the stability issue. The nice thing is that, remember how I said like, oh, there were some really disappointing results shared in Tokyo about like the scalability of the Lightning Network. If we can figure out how to make multi-party channels stable enough, they dramatically, like it's hard to quantify exactly how much better the Lightning Network gets in terms of its capital requirements if we can bump the number of parties in a channel. And like the technically optimum amount is like the square root of the number of participants in the network. But that's a ridiculous ask. Like you're not gonna, if there are like 10,000 nodes right now, yeah, there are 10,000 nodes right now, you're talking about like 100-person channels, 100-party channels, and it's like if any one of them is offline, you're fucked. Now, there are certain optimizations that you can make where it's like only certain operations require everyone's signatures, and then like there's a bunch of other operations that can only require 2 signatures, and that helps a lot. But at the end of the day, what you're then really just doing is you have this giant pool. Like let's say, you got Alice, Bob, Carol, Dave. This is like a 4-person multi-party channel. Hypothetically, you could then say, well, I've got this allocated between Carol and Dave, this one between Alice, or like Bob and Carol, and this one between Alice and Dave. And we basically set up these 2-party channels again from inside that construct. And the nice thing then is that now it just functions like the normal Lightning Network, but if we ever wanted to reallocate capital between these channels or close one of these channels or open a new one, that you wouldn't need a Bitcoin-based transaction. You would just need to do a full multi-party pool transaction in order to make that happen. And that helps with the chain efficiency of that. And so that's super nice. And that also then offloads the scenario where you need everyone's signatures to only that like capital reallocation and not the normal payment process. And so like that helps, but it's still nasty. Yeah, yeah. If you take that to its logical conclusion, you end up getting ARC. That's a cool observation, but yeah, that's right.
Do you need internet connectivity?
Yes. Just
I feel like it seemed like outside
it depends. I mean, at the end of the day, it depends on what you consider to be a fully executed transaction, right? Because on some level, at the very bare minimum, you need to communicate some piece of information to the recipient. Like if I just do nothing, right, and you know you're doing nothing, how is it possible at all for the network to have its state updated? Now, what you can do is I might be able to hand you like a piece of paper or something like that with a piece of information that you could then like put into your computer later, and then like yeah, it pulls money from the network in some way. I'm hand waving a lot. Like I don't know how a system like that would work, but like at some level, I have to give you something, or you have to give me something, right? Something has to be exchanged in order for that transaction to eventually occur. The best you can hope for is that that transmission happens offline and can be like redeemed later.
I guess like in that scenario, could a vendor enroll without connectivity accept payment from somebody for the day, go home at night, pile up those transactions during the day, go home at night and get internet connectivity and run all those transactions through?
So with the Lightning Network, no, but I think someone mentioned eCash. That is a system that eCash works very, very well for. It does not require this like super online, always on property. You can there's yes-ish, but actually eCash is really, really good with its trust assumptions between the peers in the mint. So let's say that like Sam's running a mint and you and I are part of it. If I hand you a piece of information and like to send you eCash in that mint, there's pretty much no way I can cheat you or you can cheat me in that process. We do both trust Sam in that regard, but like I can literally hand you that thing in the store, you can hand me the product, and both of us can walk away knowing that the transaction is going to happen the way we expected it to. Yes. We good? All right, let's see if I missed anything else that's important. We're not talking about PTLCs. Talked about backups. Yeah, I think we covered everything, and then some. So unless people have like more questions about like the excruciating details, I think we can break the official thing, and maybe I can get off the stage and we can chat more in the other room, or, you know. Yeah.